Hey, welcome back to the lecture. So, from this lecture onwards, let's give support for interrupt capability in our driver source file. Great. So, in the GPIO unit, actually, we have to complete this part, that is configuring the interrupt mode. And after that, we have to complete these two APIs, that is IRQ config. Actually, this API is to do the configuration of NVIC registers of the ARM Cortex MX processor, and this will be the IRQ handling. All right, in this lecture, let's concentrate upon this part. And if we see all the modes of our GPIO pin, so we have completed up to here, right? So these three are actually interrupt modes. So we can configure GPIO pin in interrupt mode with falling edge detection, rising edge detection, and rising as well as falling edge detection. So these are the three combination of modes in interrupt mode. And in earlier part of the course, we actually discussed about the interrupt design, the EXTI registers, and various other things, right? I want to give you a quick overview about the things we discussed in earlier part of the course. So remember that. So this is actually the STM32F4X GPIO pins interrupt delivery to the processor. So GPIO pin 0 delivers its interrupt on EXTI 0 line. 1 delivers interrupt on EXTI 1 line, right? And remember that all the EXTI lines from 5 to 9 are actually tied together, and they are actually connected to single IRQ number, that is 23. So this information you have to obtain from the vector table, right? And all the EXTI lines from EXTI 10 to 15 are tied together, and they are connected to a single IRQ number, that is 40. And there is a EXTI block in between, and that block does edge detection, and it also gives you registers to enable and disable the interrupt delivery to the processor. And these IRQs are actually disabled by default, so you have to configure the NVIC registers in order to enable or disable the interrupt reception on those IRQ numbers. So you have to remember all these points, and here which GPIO port it is. So this pin 0 is of which port, so that is actually decided by the sysconfig exti control register. So this also we have to configure in our GPIO init API. All right, so let's move forward. All right, so GPIO pin interrupt configuration. To implement successfully the interrupt modes on a GPIO pin, you have to follow these steps. Remember that these steps are very much common to any microcontroller you use. First thing is make sure that the pin is in input mode. So the pin must be in input mode because you are receiving an interrupt, right? And also after that, configure the edge detection or edge triggering, like which edge trigger you want. I mean, rising edge, falling edge, or both rising as well as falling edge. So this you have to configure. So this we do in EXTI registers, right? And after that, enable interrupt delivery from peripheral to the processor. So this you have to do in peripheral side. So that means this is a peripheral side, right? So here you have to do in the EXTI register by using interrupt mask register of the EXTI. And after that, identify the IRQ number on which the processor accepts the interrupt from that pin. So that means, for example, in this case, if you want to send an interrupt from this pin, then you have to identify the IRQ number. This we do by vector table, right? And after that, configure the IRQ priority for the identified IRQ number. So this you have to configure in the NVIC register. So NVIC has priority register, so there you have to do it. And after that, enable interrupt reception on that IRQ pin. Again, you have to touch the NVIC register in order to enable the IRQ number, because by default all the IRQs are disabled. And after that, implement the IRQ handler. All right, so if you're confused, don't worry. We are going to implement this step by step in our code, and your doubts will get clarified. Let's get into the IDE and let's go to the GPIO init. And here, if the mode is equal to GPIO mode IT falling edge, then the first thing what you have to do is configure the falling trigger selection register, right? All right. After that, else if mode is equal to RT, then you have to configure the RTSR. Else if this is equal to RFT, then configure both the registers. So here you have to do configure both FTSR and RTSR. Okay. So after that, what you have to do is configure the GPIO port selection in sysconfig exti control register. So don't worry, I will explain this. After that, you have to enable the exti interrupt delivery using IMR, that is interrupt mask register. So let's code all these things in the next lecture.